After the art school at NYU, College of Fine Arts, I got a few jobs here and there. I worked at Stern Brothers. I did some freelance work at a local coffee company and did a poster for, and a few other things like that, graphic work. And then I got a job at Dolbury Brothers, they were a wallpaper silk screen outfit which had a huge pieces of paper, and I was fascinated. I did a lot of the screens for them, and they required an artist to do some of these things. So I got fascinated with the mechanics of the thing, how they reproduced it and so forth. I was never exposed to anything like that before, not even in school. And so I kept that in the back of my head. I thought I'd get back to doing that someday. Anyhow, my father lost his job. He went on what they in those days used to call home relief, which is like welfare, you know. The Depression really hit us. And I heard that Juliana Force of the College Art Association was hiring artists. So I applied, and I got the job, and I was assigned to the poster project. That was a CWA, City Works Administration, and the poster project was the Mayor LaGuardia's poster project. And a chap by the name of John Weaver was the director. And so we were doing posters by hand, and they weren't of the greatest quality at that point. But as soon as I suggested that we can reproduce them by screen process, and in those days they used to call it silk screen. Today we're not using silk anymore, so that the screen process is much more accurate, just plain screen process. Anyhow, so a few of the other fellows got involved in the printing of it. We got some supplies in, and we began reproducing the posters. Of course, now that they're going to be reproduced, the quality jumped up several degrees, and it grew. It was very satisfactory, and the place really started making a lot of good posters. And after a while, Richard Floydy, who was a Bauhaus graduate, I took over the poster division. That's when the WPA came in. He was pretty fussy about the quality of work that we were doing, even if the end result, the end use, was not terribly significant, you know. But he thought that it would be good for us, in general for the poster project itself, if we did the best work we could. So he'd slap up on the wall a whole series, whatever came in, of needs of posers, and we'd study them, look at them, and then we'd tell him and say, "I'd like to try out for this one." And he said, "Okay," and we'd give him the intermediate sketches, not the thumbnail sketches, they were for ourselves, but we give him the intermediate sketches and see what he thought of them. He said, "Well, you can change this or do this," and he said, looks good, looks like something's going to come out of that. So we go ahead and do something with it. And of course, a good deal of the time, because of the competition, only something was accepted about half the time, you know. And we had to work at it a little bit. You know, Richard Floydy was the influence from the Bauhaus, and he had a nice clean style. He liked to do posters himself, and you can see from them the similarity between his posters and those that the rest of us did. But it's a very blocky, clean, abstract style, you know. It's a little vague how we were influenced by other poster artists. We picked them up, I think. Maybe there were some in art magazines. We thought the posters of Cassandra, for instance, were really works of art. And I think they were probably exhibited at a museum or two, or somewhere, you know. But we saw them, and maybe even some artists, other art in the project itself, brought in and showed us, how about these? Aren't these great? That kind of thing. You know, it's just a lot of casual influences that were around. Rayon Somerville was he was a major or a lieutenant colonel or something like that. Anyhow, he was appointed to, I guess, to keep the project going wherever is absolutely necessary, but gradually through attrition to sort of make it disappear. He was frank to admit that he didn't know anything about art, and that he knew what he liked, but that's not good enough for getting artists off the project. So he got himself a committee of artists who he thought were competent, or who they thought they were competent, in order to judge the other artists. So that was like being a traitor to your own, you know. So we gathered in there, though. I mean, there was quite a few people there. Some of them were successful artists off the project. In fact, about a third of them were ex-WPA artists. And we just didn't like the idea. We walked out. But he did his job, I guess, one way or another. And the stamp of the military was there, okay. This is before the war, incidentally, so those that got off the project got into little private things. They wanted to maintain their independence. So in our case, there were 5 artists that got together and rented a little studio for $25 a month. Each one put in $5. And we worked there for a while. And then we finally, in order to make money, or some money anyhow, to keep going, we did point of sales displays, which are posters in a sense, but posters at the point of sales. So we had used some of our skills for that, and we screened them, of course. And we had a lot of, not a lot, but customers at Fifth Avenue. We tried to hit the highest Tiffany's, Saks, that kind of thing. At that time, it was called silk screen process. And I was a little nervous about calling it, not nervous, but then, you know, I didn't like the idea, uncomfortable with the idea of calling it silk screen process. So there ought to be a shorter name like lithography, one word at least. So I cooked up the word serigraphy. I went to the library and looked up some roots and came back with that word. But here I was a young artist at that point, and I wouldn't be able to get that across to everybody. Besides, there's a certain amount of competition, and a young artist like that wouldn't get very far with especially a name of that sort. So I suggested to Carl Zagrosa, who was who wrote articles. He was not a collector. He was the director of the Hawaii Gallery, and he wrote articles for the Print Collectors Quarterly and that kind of thing. So he wrote it up, and he also had a show at the Hawaii where he called it serigraphy. So I asked him to pick up the name and do something with it, do a lot of PR around it, and it worked. Except for one thing. I was disconnected with the name from then on. They thought it was Carl Zagrosa who cooked up the word. So we had a little controversy even to this day about who did it. But that's okay. There's no problem there. There were certain specifications about designing for screening, and they learned it pretty quickly. I mean, in those days there wasn't too much you could do. I mean, you preferably you didn't do chiaroscuro, you know, the light and shades so much. You did more or less flat, blocky stuff. The screen process is excellent for that. And we got into the when we used the tush and crayon method, which had, you know, we can use the crayon. We can get into little shades. With that, we developed more when we were doing the fine artwork. But in posters, well, the blocky, dramatic stuff was much more acceptable. There were occasions where you had to use shadings here and there, but it wasn't as satisfactory as designing something especially for screening sort of a flat color work. I rebelled against that when I went to the fine art, the graphic division. I thought that there's all kinds of variations. So, and when I was demonstrating to the artists, there were about 6 or 7 different techniques that could be combined. Each one had its own characteristics and its own advantages. But they liked the tush and crayon method, I mean the artists, so that they used it almost exclusively. And the reason they did that is because when you put the tushes, the black lithographic tush, and they work directly on the screen, then they spread some glue on it in a special sort of way, which they had to, and with a little glycerin in it, you know, so that they'd be a little flexible. And then they washed out the tush and crayon, and they had a stencil. And after they were through printing, they could take it to the sink and wash off the stencil and start all over again on the same screen. So it was economical. And they found it a very good way to work. On the other hand, I didn't like it completely because I liked variety. I liked the sharp line of a stencil, and then you could use the crayon also. And depending, I did my so-called decoration empire. It was sort of a whimsical sort of title, which meant that I put an empire, put everything in it. That was a demonstration print, and I enjoyed doing that. And the poster artists had a relatively simple job. And once they got the hang of designing 4 posters, it was very simple to take the film and cut the various stencils, and that's what they did mostly. The poster board, which they call railroad board incidentally, was because it could be bent into the curve of the rail of the train on the top there, and it always came in 22/28 or 28 inches, and then you cut that in half as 14/22. You cut that in half, you got the 11/14, and those are the different sizes as they came. But started out with the railroad board, and that's what we printed. The editions were so-called editions, varied an awful lot. There were some that were up to 500, but the average I would say was around 100. And there were some even much less because they were, I mean, how far can you go? You know, health department took more than somebody else, you know. Very often they had sketches which they showed to Lynn Ward, and other times they started off and developed a print that was developed during the process. And I love to see that because that's what I wanted them to do with screening. I mean, you don't have to make a finished sketch, but you had a good concept in your mind. You can make a pencil sketch even. You say, well, I'll start with this color. So this color was deposited, and then, oh yeah, you can do this. And it was modified. The original concept may have been modified in the process. Now, you can never do that with reproduction. It's very tight, exactly the way the original is supposed to be reproduced, you know. So that had a lot of discipline, but it didn't have that spontaneous flow that you get from working in the medium itself and developing it in the medium, and which was much more exciting. Boy, I loved the smells of the place, you know, the inks and so forth. They were great. All in all, it was a very exciting period. I tell you, I was in the right place at the right time, and I was surprised. The book that the how-to book that I did, I can't remember for the life of me how it came up, but it was assigned to me because evidently I knew more about the screen process than anybody else around the place. So I did and also there was a hint in it, if I remember correctly, about using screen process as an art medium, which wasn't thought of before as anything serious, you know. There's also something else too, which we didn't go into very much at that time, but I tried to combine other mediums with screen process. The one that was most sympathetic to it was pochoir, which means French for stencil. And the combination is great because you don't have to worry about large additions or anything. And since it was a stencil method, it's sort of sympathetic to what screen process is, because that's also a stencil method, really. The difference between pochoir and screening is that the centers, let's say you have an O, and there's a center in it, because it's a donut. Now you couldn't do that with pochoir, with a regular stencil. But in screening you could, because the fabric went across it, and the center was there. It could be held up with something, so that the screening was unlimited, whereas the pochoir was rather limited. But the combination was great. I'd love to make prints in which I use both pochoir and screening. Yeah, I've done quite a bit of teaching there in that sense, not only in WPA but otherwise as well. Some of the private schools. We got very little money for that too, because it was just you had a demonstration of screen process, for instance, or I did a lecture on what is abstract art as compared with the realistic art, and that sort of thing. And I've been doing that from time to time, since then. I mean, a lot of the schools have programs where they get active artists to come in and demonstrate or give lectures and that kind of thing. We just didn't have a narrow group of friends. There seemed to be a wide, broad spectrum of friends, and that was part of our education, in a sense, because there's so many different kinds of people. There were rent parties, for instance, in those days, and so that we had dances and whatnot, and some entertainment, and that they were made especially because the artists couldn't afford their rent, especially if they had lofts. So these lofts were very good for things like dances or get-togethers or whatever. Zero Mostel was one of them. Was one of the entertainers, so-called. Although he was a painter, so he was in the so-called easel division, and he was of course, he was a stand-up comic even in those days, and he was funny as can be. As I said before, the artists were working in their desks, all in a row, just like in an architectural office, and so one day a couple of carpenters came in to do something. They had to do something, and so they were sawing away, and then the wood fell down on the floor. They did that a couple of times. Then after the third or fourth time, unconsciously and spontaneously, the artists started edging their rulers off the edge of their drawing table, and as soon as that wood hit the floor, all of the rulers into place hit the floor at the same time. So there's a rattle of that kind of thing. Well, the carpenters looked around. What's happening? Did a double take, and they did it a couple of times, and then we dropped all the rulers a couple of times, and then finally everybody laughed. But it's that sort of thing that stays in your memory a little bit. The WPA was a wonderful period, and if it wasn't for that period, because it was a maturing period for me, what would have happened later? I guess I would have gone back into the silkscreen because that was something I knew. Matter of fact, I remember after we started our own studio and the group started to become viable in terms of making a little bit of money. We instead of the 5 artists, we hired one guy, and we paid him $10 a week. We couldn't afford anymore, and we paid ourselves nothing in the beginning, and some of us lived off the sweat of our frows. To coin an expression.